So in the gym where I grow up, we have close to 30 black belts. And for me, Ryan's game was very familiar. And when they offered me a fight, I said, yes, I'm gonna fight this guy and I'm gonna knock him out in the first round.
Every few years, a fighter enters the UFC who doesn't just win fights, they change the structure of an entire division. Right now, Ilia Topuria is starting to create that kind of situation. At first, the conversation around him focused mainly on talent. Technical boxing, knockout power, composure under pressure, all of it was visible early. But as his performances continued, the discussion became more complicated. Because this is no longer just about whether Topuria is elite. The bigger question is what happens when a fighter rises so quickly that the division itself struggles to adjust around him. From an analytical standpoint, this is where the UFC's position becomes difficult. Topuria is marketable, he's undefeated, and stylistically, he creates problems for almost everyone in the division. But dominance creates complications. Once a fighter reaches a certain level, matchmaking stops being straightforward. Every decision starts affecting rankings, title opportunities, and the long-term direction of the weight class itself. And in Topuria's case, those complications are increasing rapidly. Some fans already see him as the future of the division. Others believe there are still unanswered questions. But regardless of perspective, one thing is becoming difficult to ignore. The UFC now has to build around a fighter who may already be ahead of the division's current structure. And historically, that creates pressure. Pressure on contenders, pressure on matchmaking, and pressure on the organization itself to keep momentum moving without damaging long-term value. Which raises an important question. Has Ilia Topuria simply become the next champion? Or has he become a much bigger challenge for the UFC than anyone expected? The rise of Ilia Topuria didn't follow the typical pattern of a slow-building contender. From the beginning, there was a noticeable level of confidence in the way he approached competition, not just in interviews or promotion, but in how he fought. His performances carried structure. He wasn't relying on chaos or unpredictability to win exchanges. Instead, he combined pressure with technical precision, creating the impression of a fighter operating with a clear understanding of timing and positioning. From a stylistic perspective, that immediately separated him from many others in the division. As he continued moving through the rankings, the quality of opposition increased, but the overall pattern remained consistent. Controlled pressure, sharp boxing, efficient decision-making, and perhaps most importantly, composure. Even in high-pressure moments, Topuria rarely appeared rushed. He maintained balance in exchanges, stayed disciplined in positioning, and consistently looked comfortable under pressure. That level of control accelerated the conversation around him. Fans began discussing title implications earlier than usual. Analysts focused on how his style matched up against established contenders. And with each performance, expectations continued rising. From an analytical standpoint, rapid momentum creates two things simultaneously: opportunity and disruption. Opportunity for the fighter, disruption for the division. Because once a contender begins climbing too quickly, the UFC has to make decisions earlier than expected. Matchups become more sensitive, rankings become more complicated, and established contenders suddenly face a new variable entering the title picture. In Topuria's case, that disruption became impossible to ignore, not simply because he was winning, but because of how complete he already looked while doing it. And that completeness is what started changing the conversation around his future entirely. What makes Ilia Topuria difficult to deal with isn't just power or aggression, it's efficiency. From an analytical standpoint, Topuria's style works because it removes unnecessary movement and reduces exposure while still maintaining offensive pressure. He doesn't chase exchanges recklessly, he controls them. His boxing is one of the clearest examples of this. Rather than relying purely on volume, he focuses on positioning, timing, and shot placement. He pressures opponents into defensive reactions, then capitalizes on openings created by those reactions. That creates a layered offensive system. Opponents aren't only reacting to punches, they're reacting to pressure, spacing, and anticipation. And over time, that becomes mentally exhausting. Another major factor is composure. Even during aggressive sequences, Topuria rarely looks emotionally rushed. His balance remains controlled, his feet stay underneath him, and his decisions appear calculated rather than impulsive. That matters at the elite level, Because many fighters can generate offense, far fewer can do it while staying defensively responsible. There's also the grappling threat. While much of the attention around Topuria focuses on striking, his ability to transition between phases of MMA adds another layer of complexity. Opponents can't commit fully to defending one area without exposing another. From a matchup perspective, this limits predictable strategies. Pressure fighters risk walking into counters. Counter strikers struggle with his forward movement. Grapplers have to respect his balance and defensive awareness. And when a fighter removes easy answers from the equation, the division begins adjusting around them. That's where the UFC's challenge begins. Because once a fighter becomes difficult to match stylistically against almost everyone, the entire structure of the division starts becoming harder to manage. For the UFC, dominant fighters create opportunity, but they can also create complications. And in the case of Ilia Topuria, that balance is becoming increasingly difficult to manage. From the outside, the situation may appear simple. An undefeated fighter with strong performances, growing popularity, and championship potential should be easy to build around. But matchmaking at the elite level rarely works that cleanly. Because once a fighter reaches this position, every decision carries consequences. From an analytical perspective, the UFC now faces several competing priorities at the same time. There's divisional stability, there's business value, and there's competitive legitimacy. Those factors don't always align. A fighter like Topuria creates pressure on the existing hierarchy. Established contenders still want title opportunities. Former champions remain part of the conversation, and rising names continue entering the picture. Suddenly, matchmaking becomes less about finding a fight, and more about finding the right fight. That's where the dilemma begins. If the UFC moves too quickly, they risk disrupting long-term divisional structure. If they move too slowly, they risk slowing the momentum of one of their fastest rising stars. Historically, organizations face this challenge whenever a fighter develops faster than expected. Momentum creates urgency, but urgency can complicate planning, and Topuria's position amplifies that pressure. He isn't simply another contender waiting for recognition. He's a fighter whose performances are forcing conversations earlier than many expected. That creates difficult questions. Which matchup protects competitive integrity? Which matchup maximizes interest? And which direction benefits the division long term? Because at this stage, the challenge isn't proving whether Topuria belongs near the top. The challenge is determining how the UFC manages a fighter who may already be changing the division faster than it can comfortably adapt. At the elite level of MMA, most fighters are skilled enough to compete technically. What separates certain athletes is their ability to consistently make opponents uncomfortable. And that's one of the biggest reasons Ilia Topuria has become such a difficult matchup. From an analytical standpoint, the challenge begins before the fight even starts. Because preparing for Topuria requires solving multiple problems at the same time. His boxing creates pressure at range, his movement limits clean counters, and his grappling presence forces opponents to stay cautious in transitions. That combination reduces confidence. Fighters can't fully commit to a single defensive strategy because every adjustment introduces a new risk. If they pressure forward aggressively, they risk walking into precise counters. If they stay defensive, Topuria gradually controls positioning and tempo. And if they over-focus on striking defense, the grappling threat remains in the background. This layered pressure creates hesitation, and hesitation at the highest level of MMA can completely change a fight. Another important factor is composure under momentum. Many fighters become more dangerous once they gain confidence during exchanges. Topuria appears dangerous even when exchanges are neutral. He rarely seems emotionally affected by pressure, which allows him to maintain structure regardless of the pace. That consistency is difficult to disrupt. From a psychological perspective, opponents may also feel increasing pressure due to expectations surrounding him. When a fighter develops an aura of inevitability, every mistake feels amplified. Small openings become more stressful, and decision-making can become more reactive than strategic. This doesn't mean Topuria is unbeatable, but it does explain why so many opponents appear cautious against him. Because technically, mentally, and strategically, he forces fighters into situations where easy answers disappear very quickly. As the momentum around Ilia Topuria continues to grow, the conversation surrounding him has started moving into familiar territory. Dominant performances create excitement, excitement creates projection, and projection eventually raises expectations to extreme levels. From an analytical perspective, this is where the distinction between hype and reality becomes important. There's no question that Topuria is elite. His technical ability, composure, and finishing instincts have already been demonstrated against high-level opposition. Few fighters combine pressure and efficiency as effectively as he does. But dominance in MMA is rarely permanent. Every generation eventually adjusts. Opponents study patterns, game plans evolve, and divisions begin adapting around fighters who initially appear untouchable. That process happens to nearly everyone. At the same time, it's also important not to overcorrect. Because when a fighter receives major hype, audiences often swing between extremes. Early success creates declarations of invincibility, while any difficult moment later can suddenly trigger doubt. Reality usually exists somewhere in between. From a broader perspective, Topuria's current position reflects potential meeting expectation in real time. The UFC sees a marketable star, fans see a possible long-term champion. Opponents see a dangerous stylistic challenge, and all three perspectives can be true simultaneously. The real question is sustainability. Can he maintain this level as the pressure increases? Can he continue adapting once the division fully prepares for him? And can the UFC build around that momentum without creating unnecessary complications? Those questions haven't been answered yet. But the fact that they're already being asked says a lot about how quickly Topuria has changed the conversation around the division. And that's exactly why the situation has become so important for the UFC moving forward. At this stage, Ilia Topuria represents more than just another rising contender. He represents a shift in the division's balance. From an analytical standpoint, that's what makes the UFC situation so complicated. Fighters like Topuria don't simply enter title conversations, they begin changing how the entire division is structured around them. His rise has combined several elements at once: technical efficiency, composure under pressure, finishing ability, and growing mainstream attention. Very few fighters develop all of those factors simultaneously. That's why the conversation around him accelerated so quickly. But rapid momentum always creates pressure. Pressure on the UFC to make the right matchmaking decisions. Pressure on contenders trying to protect their position. And pressure on Topuria himself to maintain expectations that continue increasing after every performance. Historically, this stage of a fighter's career is where perception becomes difficult to manage. If dominance continues, the hype grows even larger. If resistance appears, public expectations begin shifting immediately, and that balance will likely define the next phase of Topuria's career. From a broader perspective, the UFC's challenge isn't whether he belongs at the top anymore. It's how to build around a fighter who may already be evolving faster than the division around him. Because once a fighter becomes technically difficult, marketable, and undefeated at the same time, every future decision carries more weight. At this point, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The UFC isn't just dealing with another talented contender. It's dealing with a fighter who could shape the direction of the division for years to come. And when that happens, the question stops being whether the fighter is ready. The question becomes whether the division is ready for him.